Central Plains, October 1879. While traveling settlers threw up canvas wall tents in 10 minutes flat, one man spent 3 hours cutting prairie bluestem and weaving it into a half-dome shelter 7 feet wide and 5 feet high. His fellow travelers called it primitive. They laughed openly. Grass was for livestock bedding, not shelter. Canvas tents were standard frontier practice, weighed 12 to 18 pounds, and were sold by every outfitter from Omaha to Dodge City. His grass walls stood 8 to 10 inches thick, anchored with willow ribs and sod blocks. They called it a waste of daylight. Then midnight arrived. A blue norther hit without warning. Temperature plunged from 48 degrees to 8 degrees in less than 12 hours. Wind chill dropped below -10, lethal range for exposed skin within 30 to 45 minutes. Canvas tents flapped violently, offering almost no insulation. Frost formed on the inside walls, dripping meltwater onto blankets. Fingers went numb within 20 minutes. 2 men developed frostbite on their ears and hands before dawn. But inside that grass shelter, the temperature held at 32 to 35 degrees, not warm, but survivable without tissue damage. What did he understand about trapped air, wind resistance, and prairie survival that everyone else dismissed as backward? If you respect real stories that carry lessons worth passing on, make sure to subscribe. There are more historical accounts ahead. Comment your city and time so we know where this documentary found you. The wind came first, steady out of the northwest at 25 miles per hour. By dusk, the temperature had already fallen from 48 degrees to 28 degrees in less than 6 hours. On the open prairie in late October, there was nowhere to hide except what you brought with you. The traveling settler set down his pack near a shallow depression where the land dropped away just enough to break the wind at ground level. He was a transient by necessity, moving between rail stops and cattle routes in central Kansas, carrying everything he owned on his back. He had made this journey before, knew the rhythm of plains weather, and understood that comfort on the frontier belonged to those who prepared rather than hoped. While the other travelers immediately began pitching their canvas wall tents, he walked out into the grassland with a folding knife and began cutting. Prairie bluestem and switchgrass grew thick here, the stems still green enough at the base to be flexible. He worked methodically, gathering armfuls and laying them in bundles near his chosen site. The grass was tall, some stalks reaching 5 feet, and he selected the longest, straightest pieces he could find. Behind him, canvas snapped in the wind as the others drove stakes and tied guy lines. One tent went up in 8 minutes. Another in 12. The travelers moved with the efficiency of men who had done this hundreds of times, trusting equipment that had been standard issue for the Army and sold by every outfitter from Omaha to Dodge City. The tents weighed 12 to 18 pounds, folded into compact bundles, and represented the accepted wisdom of frontier travel. The man cutting grass drew attention quickly. A teamster passing by slowed his wagon and called out, asking if he planned to bed down in a haystack. Another traveler laughed openly, saying grass was for livestock bedding, not shelter. Someone else muttered that it would blow apart before midnight. The mockery was casual but persistent, the kind of social correction that enforced conformity on the trail. He ignored them and continued working. He had seen this design before, watched it built by Lakota families during a brutal November cold snap 3 years earlier. The method was older than anyone could say, refined over generations of plains winters, and it worked because it respected the wind instead of fighting it. He began by cutting willow branches from a creek bed 200 yards east, trimming them into flexible ribs roughly 6 feet long. These he planted in a rough circle 7 feet across, bending them inward to form a dome frame. The structure was low, no more than 5 feet at the peak, and he kept the profile squat and rounded. Wind would pass over it rather than catch against flat surfaces. Next came the weaving. He took bundles of prairie grass and began layering them onto the willow frame, working from the bottom up, overlapping each course like shingles. The grass was still pliable enough to bend and compact, and he pressed it tight, building the wall to 8 inches thick, then 10. Each hollow stem trapped air, and the mass of packed vegetation formed a barrier far denser than it appeared. He cut sod blocks from the depression's edge and placed them around the base, anchoring the grass walls and sealing the gap between shelter and ground. The entrance faced downwind, away from the northwest blow, and he kept it small, no taller than 30 inches, forcing anyone entering to crouch low. The entire process took 2 hours and 40 minutes. By the time he finished, the canvas tents were already buttoned tight, their occupants settling in for the night. Frost was beginning to form on the windward side of the grass shelter, a thin white rime that stiffened the outer layer. As night fell, the settlers crawled into their tents confident in accepted wisdom. The grass shelter sat squat and silent, already disappearing into the landscape. Shortly after midnight, the wind shifted. What had been a steady northwest blow became something harder, colder, driven by a mass of Arctic air that had broken loose from Canada and was now pouring south across the plains with nothing to stop it. This was a blue norther, the kind of weather event that could drop temperatures 30 degrees in 3 hours and leave men dead by morning if they were caught unprepared. The temperature plunged to 12 degrees by 1 in the morning, then 8 degrees by dawn. Wind chill dropped below -10 degrees, a lethal range where exposed skin could develop frostbite within 30 to 45 minutes. The air itself became a weapon, stripping heat from anything it touched. Inside the canvas tents, the failure began immediately. The fabric, designed to shed rain and block light, offered an insulation value near R1 when dry. Once the frost stiffened the material, that value dropped even further. Heat generated by human bodies escaped through the thin walls almost as fast as it was produced, and the wind found every seam, every grommet hole, every place where the canvas pulled tight against the stakes. Frost formed on the inside walls first, a thin white layer that appeared within 20 minutes of the temperature drop. As the night wore on, that frost thickened, and when body heat caused small sections to melt, water dripped onto blankets and clothing. Wet wool lost most of its insulating capacity, and the cold penetrated deeper. The men inside tried to compensate. They wrapped themselves tighter in their bedrolls, pulled hats low over their ears, and drew their knees to their chests to minimize surface area. It was not enough. Fingers went numb within 20 minutes of lying still. Toes followed soon after. The cold worked its way through leather boot soles and multiple layers of socks, finding the extremities first, then creeping inward toward the core. One traveler, a teamster who had laughed at the grass shelter earlier that evening, found his hands so stiff by 2 in the morning that he could not work the buttons on his coat. Another man developed the waxy, pale appearance on his ears that marked the early stages of frostbite, the tissue starved of blood as his body prioritized keeping vital organs warm. Sleep became impossible after 2 o'clock. The shivering was too violent, the cold too penetrating, and the knowledge that dawn was still hours away too demoralizing. By 3 in the morning, one man abandoned his tent entirely. He crawled out into the wind, stumbled to the nearest wagon, and crouched behind it, wrapped in every blanket he owned. The wagon bed blocked some of the wind, but the cold found him anyway. He shivered violently, his jaw clenched tight, and waited for sunrise. Inside the grass shelter, the air was still. The wind that tore at the canvas tents passed over the low dome without catching, deflected by the curved shape and the anchored sod base. The grass walls absorbed the outer cold, the hollow stems trapping air in thousands of tiny pockets, and the thick mass of vegetation slowed the heat loss to a crawl. An alcohol thermometer placed near the center of the shelter would have read 32 to 35 degrees, measured later by men who needed to understand what had happened. It was not warm. It was not comfortable. But it was survivable without tissue damage, and that difference, measured in degrees and hours, was the difference that mattered. Coyotes howled across the frozen grassland, their voices carried on the relentless wind. The stars burned cold and clear overhead, indifferent to the struggle below. The shelter worked because prairie grass traps air. Each hollow stem, from the thick bluestem stalks to the finer switchgrass blades, functions as a microscopic insulator when packed tightly together. The cellular structure of the grass creates thousands of tiny air pockets, and still air is one of nature's most effective barriers to heat transfer. Modern fiber insulation operates on the same principle, but the Plains tribes had understood it for generations before the first synthetic bat was ever manufactured. Packed to 8 or 10 inches thick, the grass wall functioned with an effective insulation value estimated at R6 to R8, roughly equivalent to a modern fiberglass bat. That measurement, reconstructed from thermal studies conducted decades later, represented a barrier 6 to 8 times more effective than the single layer of canvas that covered the standard tents. Wind penetration was reduced by over 90%, not because the grass formed an airtight seal, but because the dense mass of interwoven stems broke up airflow into countless tiny currents that lost their force before reaching the interior. The half-dome shape mattered as much as the material. Wind hitting a vertical surface creates pressure that forces cold air through any gap or weakness. Wind hitting a curved surface slides over it, following the path of least resistance. The low profile meant less surface area exposed to the moving air, and the rounded top shed the wind instead of fighting it. Physics favored the dome in every measurable way. The low ceiling reduced the cubic volume of air that needed to be kept warm. A standard wall tent stood 6 feet high at the peak, creating roughly 200 cubic feet of interior space per occupant. The grass shelter, at 5 feet high and 7 feet across, contained less than half that volume. Smaller spaces require less energy to maintain temperature, and with only body heat available as a source, every cubic foot mattered. Ground contact captured residual warmth from the earth itself. Even in late October, soil temperature at shallow depth held near 45 degrees, significantly warmer than the 8-degree air above. The sod blocks anchoring the base conducted that ground warmth inward while sealing the gap where cold air might otherwise have entered. The canvas tents, elevated on stakes and guy lines, lost that advantage entirely, suspended in the freezing air with no thermal connection to the relatively warmer ground below. The grass walls absorbed frost instead of condensing it overhead. When moisture-laden air from human breath met the cold interior surface of canvas, it immediately condensed into water droplets that dripped back down. The porous grass absorbed that moisture into its cellular structure, distributing it across thousands of stems where it froze in place rather than forming heavy droplets. The result was a drier interior and no wet bedding by morning. These principles were not theoretical abstractions. Plains tribes, including the Lakota and Pawnee, had built grass and earth lodges for precisely these reasons. Homesteader diaries from Nebraska and Kansas repeatedly noted grass shelters staying 15 to 25 degrees warmer than canvas during sudden cold snaps, observations recorded by men who had no formal training in thermodynamics but understood survival through direct experience. The man who built the shelter that night had learned the method by watching a Lakota family construct a temporary winter camp 3 years earlier. He had not understood the physics at the time, but he had observed the results. The structure stayed warm when everything else froze. The design required no purchased materials, no specialized tools, and no fuel to maintain. It worked because it aligned with natural principles rather than fighting them. By morning, the difference was written on skin. One method preserved circulation and core temperature. The other did not. Sunrise revealed the cost of the night in precise detail. The canvas tents stood rimed white with frost, their guy lines stiff as wire, their fabric crackling when touched. Men emerged slowly, moving with the careful deliberation of those whose bodies had been pushed to the edge of failure. Hands were swollen, fingers thick and clumsy. One traveler could not lace his boots because his fingers would not bend properly. Another's ears were waxy and pale, the classic appearance of frostbite where tissue has been starved of blood for hours. The teamster who had abandoned his tent before dawn was found behind the wagon, still shivering despite the rising sun. His face was drawn, his lips blue-tinged, and he moved like a man decades older than his actual age. He had burned no firewood because there was none to burn on the open prairie, and his body had fought the cold alone all night, exhausting reserves it would take days to rebuild. The man from the grass shelter emerged stiff but intact. He crawled out through the low entrance, stood slowly, and stretched muscles that had spent the night motionless but never dangerously cold. There was no frostbite on his hands or face. His bedding was dry. He had slept in 2 wool blankets and burned 0 firewood because the shelter itself had done the work of keeping him alive. The mockery disappeared. In its place came questions, direct and urgent, asked by men who understood they had miscalculated badly and needed better answers before the next cold snap arrived. How thick were the walls? 8 to 10 inches, packed tight. Which grass worked best? Any tall prairie grass with hollow stems, bluestem, switchgrass, even big bluestem if it was still flexible enough to weave. How long did it take? 2 to 3 hours if you knew what you were doing and the materials were close. Could it be reused? Yes, for weeks with minor repairs, longer if you reinforced the structure with additional layers. The numbers told the story more clearly than words. The grass shelter interior had stayed 20 to 25 degrees warmer than the ambient air outside, a difference that separated survival from injury. No fuel had been consumed, while men in the canvas tents had burned through 3 to 5 pounds of firewood in small fires that provided almost no lasting warmth. The materials for the shelter had been gathered within 100 yards of the building site, requiring no purchased goods, no freight costs, and no dependence on supply lines that might fail when weather turned. One traveler asked if the method came from the tribes. The builder nodded and said he had watched a Lakota family construct something similar during a November cold snap 3 years back. He had not understood why it worked at the time, only that it did, and that was knowledge worth remembering. By mid-morning, the wind had died down and the temperature had climbed back to 20 degrees. The immediate danger had passed, but the lesson remained fresh. 2 of the travelers began cutting grass themselves, working slowly with stiff fingers, trying to replicate what they had dismissed as primitive the night before. They asked questions as they worked, and the builder answered them plainly, explaining the willow frame, the overlapping layers, the sawed anchors, the low entrance facing away from prevailing wind. The canvas tents were packed away, but they would be pitched again at the next camp. Old habits died hard, and manufactured gear carried the weight of institutional authority. But now there was an alternative, proven under conditions that had nearly killed men who trusted conventional wisdom. The knowledge had entered circulation, carried forward by those who had felt the difference in their bones. Grass shelters began appearing along cattle trails and rail spurs in the months that followed. The design spread quietly, carried by drovers and teamsters who had survived their own cold snaps or heard the story from someone who had. Homesteaders adopted the method as emergency storm housing, building temporary structures near their main cabins to use when blizzards made reaching the barn or outhouse dangerous. The shelters required no lumber, no nails, no purchased materials of any kind, and they could be constructed in an afternoon by anyone willing to cut grass and weave it tight. Army survey reports from the early 1880s noted indigenous grass huts as remarkably resistant to wind chill, a grudging acknowledgement from engineers trained in conventional construction methods. The reports included rough sketches and measurements, attempts to document a technology that had existed for centuries but was only now being recognized as legitimate by institutional authorities. The language was careful, almost defensive, as if admitting the effectiveness of traditional methods required justification. Diaries from Kansas and Nebraska homesteaders preserved the practical details. One entry from the winter of 1882 described a grass shelter built in 3 hours that kept a family of 4 alive during a 3-day blizzard when their main cabin's chimney became blocked with ice. Another diary noted that grass walls stayed 15 degrees warmer than the uninsulated wooden walls of a hastily built claim shanty, a difference that meant the children could sleep without waking from the cold. These were not romantic accounts or philosophical reflections. They were survival notes, measurements recorded by people who needed to remember what worked. The method never replaced conventional housing. Grass shelters were temporary, functional, and unimpressive to look at. They did not signal permanence or prosperity. They could not be photographed well for promotional material sent back east to attract new settlers. Lumber towns and hardware suppliers had no financial interest in promoting construction methods that required no purchased goods. The cultural momentum of westward expansion favored buildings that looked like the ones left behind, not structures that acknowledged the land's own terms. But the knowledge survived because it worked when it mattered. Modern thermal studies confirm what the plains already knew. Still air insulates better than fabric. Shape matters more than thickness alone. Preparation beats speed when conditions turn lethal. These principles hold true whether the insulation is prairie grass or fiberglass, whether the structure is a willow-framed dome or a modern survival shelter built from emergency materials. Museums in Kansas and Nebraska preserve woven grass panels behind glass, artifacts from a time when survival required adaptation rather than importation. The displays include context about plains tribes who refined these methods over generations, homesteaders who learned them through necessity, and the environmental conditions that made the knowledge worth preserving. School groups pass through, reading placards that explain our values and wind resistance, concepts that would have been unfamiliar to the original builders but describe principles they understood through direct experience. The lesson outlasted the cold that tested it. Survival on the open prairie did not belong to the man who built fastest or carried the most expensive gear. It belonged to the one who built with the land instead of against it, who recognized that traditional knowledge existed because it had been tested over time, and who understood that mockery was cheap while frostbite was permanent. The grass shelter that night saved one life directly, but the method it represented saved more in the years that followed, each time someone chose preparation over convenience and proven technique over accepted wisdom.